We have already looked at some classical sociological theories in this series, those of Durkheim, Marx, and Weber. If you haven't yet seen these videos, please check them out. Today, we are going to look at the ideas of one thinker who both built upon and also criticized some of the ideas of the three thinkers that we have already looked at. This is German philosopher and sociologist Theodor Adorno. Okay, so let's get into it. What was Adorno's theory? So, as always, let me start with a quote. You might have encountered this before. We should not ask too much of our poor fellow human beings that they be individually different, since what distinguishes the modern human being is precisely that he or she is not an individual. That's not exactly what Adorno said, but it's close. And we will come back to that original quote in a moment. But first, what was Adorno's theory? Well, it's not really a single theory. Instead, there are a few key concepts that run through his work and help us make sense of his thought. And we can organize these concepts around the idea of society. What kind of society did Adorno think we live in? How does that society affect people, and how do people supposedly respond to this society? Adorno, along with other intellectuals of that period, including Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, among others, came together in Frankfurt and became known as the Frankfurt School. They were associated with the Institute for Social Research, and their thinking is sometimes grouped together under the heading of critical theory. They all shared the view that capitalist society was a mass, consumer society, within which individuals were categorized, subsumed, and governed by highly restrictive social, economic, and political structures that had little interest in specific individuals. For Adorno, this created a situation where individuals could not freely develop themselves. They were instead manufactured into certain kinds of subjects by the society itself, subjects that conformed to the needs of that society. In other words, rather than starting out as individuals and then relating to the world around them, for Adorno, individuals are produced by the world around them. And that world is increasingly dominated by capitalism. This is why I said at the beginning that it wasn't a single theory, it's more a collection of related ideas. And Adorno worked and reworked these ideas over the course of his career, often in response to the changing nature of society. But two of the most important concepts from his work are culture industry and the concept of negative dialectics. Let's start with the concept of culture industry. As the term suggests, Adorno was interested in culture, specifically popular culture, and how that culture was produced and consumed. He argued that the culture produced by the culture industry would simply reflect the values of capitalism, such as individualism, competition, and an uncritical acceptance of authority. The idea here is that the culture that is produced by the culture industry is made for the masses. It is standardized, formulaic, and predictable, which means that it doesn't challenge the ways of thinking that capitalism produces. Rather, it simply reflects them. Now, when Adorno and the other members of the Frankfurt School were writing about this, they were talking primarily about film and radio, but today we might extend this concept to include television, music, the internet, YouTube, Netflix, and so on. And indeed, Adorno himself did extend the concept in this way as the means of cultural production changed. Importantly, the idea of the culture industry is not just that the arts and entertainment reflect the dominant ideology. It's also that they produce that ideology in the minds of consumers, meaning that the status quo is continually reproduced. So, for example, if we were to look at a superhero movie, something like a Marvel film, we could say that the emphasis on individualism, on competition, and on accepting authority are reflected in the story, and therefore the audience is likely to leave the cinema with those ideas reinforced. Let's look at another example. Have you ever noticed how many products, logos, and advertisements feature the color red? Well, studies show that the color red evokes excitement, passion, and energy. So if a product has the color red on it, it grabs your attention and makes you feel excited about buying it. That is, it tells you that you need this thing. Companies know this and use it to their advantage. So in other words, the very way that products are marketed to us is part of the process of producing consent to those capitalist relations that govern our lives. But consent is given without our even realizing it, because the culture industry makes it seem as though there is no alternative to the way things are. This is what Adorno meant when he said that we shouldn't ask too much of our fellow human beings, that they be individually different. The culture industry makes it difficult for us to be individuals because it produces a standardization of tastes, values, attitudes, and desires. We are instead manufactured into certain kinds of subjects who consume what the market wants us to consume. Now, Adorno was never comfortable with the idea of banning or censoring the arts and entertainment industries. Doing so would only reinforce the power of the state. His intention was not to suggest that this sort of outcome, but rather to try to understand how these sorts of systems operate and how they influence the way we think. But there is another idea in Adorno's work that helps us understand that influence. It's the idea of negative dialectics. Adorno developed this idea in Negative Dialectics, a book written late in his life. In that book, he tries to set out a method for thinking about the world that avoids some of the pitfalls of traditional philosophical thinking. Philosophers, according to Adorno, tend to proceed by trying to systematize knowledge and fit everything into a grand narrative. Unfortunately, this tends to ignore or oppress the particularity of real-life situations. The attempt to impose a universal truth leads to a kind of violence against particular realities. To avoid this, Adorno proposed negative dialectics, a way of thinking that starts out from particular situations and moves towards a kind of non-violent understanding of the whole. Negative dialectics refuses totality. Instead of trying to explain everything, it focuses on the connections between things and allows contradictions to remain unresolved. The key idea here is that concepts and categories are always inadequate to describe reality. Reality is always in excess of our conceptual frameworks. We can never fully capture it. The reason this is the case is because the world is always changing. And if it is always changing, then any fixed meaning that we might want to ascribe to things will always be out of date. Remember our discussion of how meaning is created through language games in the video on Wittgenstein? Well, the same idea applies here. Language always falls short of reality because reality is always changing. And any meaning that we fix to our words will always be provisional. There is always more to say, and this means that we should always be open to changing our minds. So let's bring this back to society. For Adorno, the attempt to create grand narratives about history and society and to fit everything into a particular conceptual scheme is always going to fail, because reality will always exceed our conceptual frameworks. Society is too complex. There are too many variables. Any story that we tell about it is always going to oversimplify. It's going to leave something out. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand society, however. It just means that we should proceed in a way that is sensitive to its complexity, in a way that acknowledges that we will never truly capture all of its complexities. It means that we should listen to the voices that are usually silenced in the telling of grand historical narratives, the stories of particular individuals, because it is in those stories, according to Adorno, that we find the potential for resistance to the forces of homogenization that threaten to turn us into nothing more than consumers. That's it for this video. Please be sure to subscribe if you want to be notified when the next video comes out. I hope this video helped you understand Adorno's ideas. If you would like to learn more about him, I highly recommend reading his Negative Dialectics. It's a challenging read, but it's well worth the effort. Thanks for watching.